A grieving husband stands before a barrage of cameras, weeping over his murdered 20-year-old wife. He describes a brutal home invasion, ruthless thieves breaking in, tying him up, and smothering her beside their infant. It is a flawless, terrifying performance that paralyzes a nation until the victim's own pulse betrays him. A biometric smartwatch strapped to her wrist silently recorded the exact moment her heart stopped, hours before the alleged killers ever smashed the door. This was no random tragedy. It was a meticulously directed execution. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Before the illusion of the perfect family shattered on national television, the foundations of this fatal dynamic were laid across two vastly different landscapes. Caroline Crouch was born in the United Kingdom in the summer of 2001, but her identity was forged on the rugged, sun-baked island of Alonissos. Situated about 175 miles north of Athens, the island is a tightly knit community surrounded by the deep waters of the Aegean Sea. For a child, it was a paradise of steep cliffs and isolated pebble beaches. Her parents relocated there seeking a quieter life, and their daughter adapted instantly. She grew up wild and free, deeply connected to the natural world. Those who watched her mature remembered a girl vibrating with kinetic energy. She was an advanced scuba diver, a dedicated scout, and a kickboxing enthusiast. There was nothing fragile about her. She spent her weekends hiking the island's uneven trails and rescuing stray animals, developing a fierce independence that defined her teenage years. Her dual heritage, British roots planted in Greek soil, gave her a unique charm, making her a beloved fixture among the locals. She was bright, ambitious, and looking toward a future that seemed entirely boundless. In stark contrast to her untamed island upbringing was the highly structured, calculated world of Charalambos Anagnostopoulos, known to everyone simply as Babis. Born 13 years before her, he grew up in the sprawling urban expanse of the Greek capital. He carved out a lucrative and highly respected career as a civil aviation pilot and flight instructor. Commanding twin-engine helicopters, he ferried wealthy tourists and corporate executives between the mainland and the scattered luxury resorts of the islands. His profession required specific psychological architecture. Piloting a helicopter is an exercise in absolute, unyielding control. A pilot must process multiple streams of complex data, compartmentalize stress, and maintain a facade of supreme confidence, regardless of the turbulence outside the cockpit. Babis excelled at this. He was accustomed to being the smartest man in the room, or at least projecting the illusion that he was. To the outside world, his image was flawless. He wore his uniform well, carried himself with a quiet, authoritative grace, and spoke in the measured, reassuring tones of a man with thousands of flight hours under his belt. He was the kind of professional that protective parents instinctively trusted, a man who seemed to offer financial stability, maturity, and safety. There was no outward indication of a volatile temper or an unpredictable nature. His entire existence was built on precision, routine, and managing the perceptions of those around him. These two contrasting figures represented completely different elements. She was the sea, restless, transparent, and fiercely independent. He was the machine, calculated, rigid, and demanding total compliance. Their orbits were entirely separate until his flight routes began bringing him to Alonissos. The island, usually a sanctuary for the young girl, suddenly became the backdrop for an intersection that would eventually trap her. The distance between their ages and their worlds should have kept them apart. She was still navigating the complexities of high school, while he was a seasoned professional in his late 20s, operating in an adult sphere of high-stakes aviation and mainland wealth. Yet the isolation of island life often accelerates connections. He presented a polished, worldly alternative to the small-town boys she knew. And for him, her vibrant, untested spirit was something beautiful that he could mold, direct, and ultimately possess. The polished pilot and the island girl seemed like an unlikely match, but his facade was meticulously engineered to bypass the defenses of a young mind, setting the stage for a relationship built on a quiet, escalating capture. The intersection of their lives began during a crowded summer festival on her native island. He did not arrive as an ordinary tourist. He entered her sphere with the polished, commanding presence of an established aviator. He leveraged his profession masterfully, frequently routing his flight paths to pass low over the island's coastline. The heavy, rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the coastal wind became a personal calling card, an auditory flex of wealth and status designed to captivate a teenager. He played a patient, highly calculated game. Rather than aggressively pursuing her, he systematically charmed her support network. He presented himself to her parents as a grounded, mature protector, a man who had already conquered the professional world and could offer their daughter unparalleled security. His infiltration of her family unit was so seamless that they practically handed her over. As her high school graduation approached, the invisible wires of his control began to tighten. The transition from the rugged freedom of the island to the sprawling concrete grid of the mainland marked his first major psychological victory. When she moved to Athens to pursue a university degree in statistics, she was instantly severed from her lifelong friends and the protective bubble of her tight-knit community. In a metropolitan expanse of 4 million people, she was adrift, and the pilot positioned himself as her only anchor. He orchestrated the relocation flawlessly, ensuring she relied on him entirely for navigation, logistics, and emotional support. The courtship was quickly solidified by a highly secretive wedding ceremony in Portugal, a location chosen not for romance, but for isolation. By holding the ceremony hundreds of miles away from her extended family, he ensured the event was strictly under his direction. Upon returning to Greece, they purchased a multi-level property in a quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood. From the street, the newly built home radiated modern domestic success. Inside, it functioned as a sophisticated, sterile cage. The pilot immediately executed a total financial blackout. The young bride was forbidden from holding a personal bank account, possessing credit cards, or carrying cash. If she needed to purchase groceries or pay for a cab ride to her classes, she was required to submit a verbal request. He would then transfer the exact, meticulously calculated amount to a temporary digital wallet. His obsession with dominance quickly metastasized into electronic surveillance. He installed location tracking software on her smartphone, transforming a modern convenience into a digital leash. Every mile she traveled, every minute she lingered at a cafe, was logged and analyzed. The fierce, independent girl who once scaled uneven island cliffs was now confined to a tightly managed urban radius. To cope with the crushing, silent solitude of the suburban house, she adopted a small, mixed-breed puppy. It was a desperate attempt to bring something warm, chaotic, and unconditionally loving into a deeply sterilized environment. The birth of their daughter introduced a volatile new variable into his carefully calibrated system. Motherhood fundamentally altered her psychology, overriding his programming with raw, protective instincts. But he quickly weaponized the postpartum period against her. As the grueling exhaustion of caring for an infant set in, his psychological grip only tightened. The young mother began documenting her suffocating reality in a digital diary, locking her rawest thoughts behind encrypted passwords. Through indirect phrasing, her entries revealed a woman waking up to her own entrapment. She documented violent, shouting arguments, the physical revulsion she felt when he entered the room, and her growing realization that she had to leave before she was completely erased. The tension reached a critical mass when she demanded professional intervention. The couple began attending sessions with a clinical psychotherapist. It was a rare, fatal miscalculation on the pilot's part. He walked into the clinic fully expecting to manipulate the counselor into diagnosing his wife as unstable or hysterical. Instead, the seasoned therapist immediately identified the severe coercive control and narcissistic abuse dominating the marriage. During private, agonizing moments in the office, the young mother confessed her absolute terror. She revealed she was actively searching for a secure rental apartment to flee with her baby. When the therapist attempted to address the toxic power imbalance during a joint session, the husband's facade cracked. He abruptly terminated the therapy. He recognized the immediate threat. His perfect image was being actively dismantled, and his primary asset was preparing a quiet exit. The final weeks in the suburban house were defined by a suffocating, hostile silence. She began researching moving logistics and touring safe housing. He monitored these digital breadcrumbs with escalating panic. For a man whose entire identity relied on projecting absolute authority and perfection, the prospect of being publicly abandoned by a woman he considered his property was an intolerable humiliation. The control he had spent years engineering was rapidly unraveling, and the machine was preparing a devastating, permanent correction. The suburban street in Glycanera was completely silent. It was the dead of night, a time when the sprawling metropolitan grid outside Athens powers down, leaving residential blocks bathed in the faint amber glow of sodium streetlights. The tri-level property stood locked and seemingly impenetrable. Inside, the atmosphere was dark, heavily air-conditioned, and deeply still. The young mother, the pilot, and their infant daughter slept in the expansive attic suite on the highest floor, nestled beneath the slanted architectural lines of the roof. Downstairs, the mixed-breed puppy roamed the ground level. It was a picture of absolute, fortified domestic security. Then, the narrative he provided to the authorities began to unfold. It was a tale of sudden, overwhelming violence, a home invasion executed with the cold efficiency of a paramilitary operation. According to his official statement, the breach occurred in the darkest hours of the morning. He claimed a crew of highly organized thieves targeted the property. They bypassed the heavy front entrance, moving to the rear of the house. They found a narrow basement window located just a few feet above the exterior concrete. The glass was quietly removed. The frame was fractured. Dark figures slipped into the subterranean level of the home. The intruders were supposedly professionals. They moved with a predatory silence, immediately locating the primary security console. They ripped the memory card from the surveillance system, blinding the digital eyes of the house. But there was a biological alarm system they had to neutralize: the puppy. The pilot recounted the first horrifying act of the invasion. As the men ascended from the basement to the ground floor, the dog began to react. To prevent a warning bark from echoing up the stairwell, the intruders moved with ruthless speed. He described them grabbing the animal, utilizing its own leash, and violently suspending it from the wooden banister of the living room staircase. It was a cold, calculated execution, designed to clear the path upward without waking the neighborhood. Footsteps vibrated through the hardwood floors. They climbed one flight, then another, approaching the attic. The bedroom door violently kicked open. Flashlights sliced through the pitch-black room, blinding the sleeping couple. 3 men, dressed entirely in dark tactical clothing, faces heavily obscured by tight balaclavas. They gripped heavy handguns, sweeping the barrels across the bed. The pilot described a blur of adrenaline and panic. Short, barked commands. Rough hands pulling him from the mattress. He claimed they threw him face down onto the floor planks, pressing the cold steel of a weapon against his temple. They moved quickly to neutralize him. Heavy adhesive duct tape was wrapped tight around his eyes, blinding him entirely. More tape was slashed across his mouth, sealing his lips. His wrists and ankles were bound tightly behind his back with rope and fabric. He was rendered completely paralyzed, a helpless hostage lying in the dark, forced to listen to the nightmare unfolding inches away. The intruders wanted money. They demanded the hidden cash. The pilot indicated through muffled, panicked sounds that he would cooperate. He directed them to a specific hiding spot, a hollowed-out board game box tucked away in a closet. Inside was a massive bundle of cash, tens of thousands in paper currency recently withdrawn for a scheduled land purchase. It was a specific, highly lucrative score. But the money was not enough. The young mother was awake. She was terrified, but she was not passive. The pilot detailed how her martial arts training kicked in. She began to fight back, thrashing violently against the men attempting to restrain her. The attic descended into chaos. The sounds of a desperate physical struggle echoed off the slanted ceiling. To force her compliance, one of the men pointed a heavy revolver directly at the head of the crying infant. She continued to scream. She continued to fight. The thieves, growing desperate to silence her before the noise breached the exterior walls, escalated their violence. The pilot lay paralyzed on the floor, listening to the agonizing finale. He described the sounds of heavy bodies pinning his wife face down into the soft mattress. He heard the terrifying, muffled noises of forced asphyxiation. The intruders pressed a heavy pillow over her face, applying relentless downward pressure. He recounted the sounds of her lungs fighting for oxygen, the frantic kicking of her legs against the bed frame. And then, the heavy, devastating silence that followed. The attackers ransacked the rest of the room, tearing through drawers and ripping expensive jewelry from their velvet boxes. Within minutes, the heavy boots retreated down the stairs. The front door clicked. The house fell back into a dead, horrifying quiet, punctuated only by the frantic wailing of the infant left on the bed. For hours, the pilot claimed he lay bound on the floor, fighting against the heavy tape and tight ropes. The sun slowly rose, bleeding pale morning light through the attic blinds. He described an exhausting, agonizing physical struggle to reach his dropped smartphone. Blinded and gagged, he supposedly dragged his bound body across the floorboards. Using only his nose and chin, he managed to strike the screen, desperately punching in the 3 digits for the emergency dispatch. The emergency operator picked up. There was no voice on the other end, only heavy, muffled breathing, panicked grunts, and the distant, echoing cries of a baby. The rapid response unit of the Hellenic police arrived within minutes. Heavily armed officers surrounded the perimeter. They noted the broken basement window. Weapons drawn, they breached the heavy front door, shattering the locking mechanism. The officers stepped into the foyer. The smell of adrenaline and stale air hit them immediately. Flashlights cut through the gloom. The first thing they saw, suspended from the staircase banister, was the lifeless body of the puppy. The visual confirmed their worst fears. This was an active, violently hostile crime scene. They cleared the ground floor in seconds. Rifles raised, they moved up the wooden stairs, their heavy boots making the only sound besides the relentless crying drifting down from the top floor. They cleared the second level, nothing. They stacked up outside the attic door. They pushed inside. The scene perfectly matched the horrific narrative. The room was utterly destroyed. Drawers were pulled from their tracks. Clothing was scattered. On the floor near the bed lay the pilot, bound, blindfolded, and hyperventilating behind layers of thick silver tape. And on the bed, lying face down amidst the tangled, ruined sheets, was the young mother. She was completely motionless. Next to her, patting her cold shoulder and crying out for a response that would never come, was the infant. It was a tableau of absolute devastation, a perfect, tragic crime scene that would immediately ignite a nationwide panic and send the police hunting for a phantom crew of merciless killers. The extraction was chaotic, bathed in the harsh blue strobes of emergency vehicles. Paramedics rushed into the stifling attic, peeling the heavy silver tape from the pilot's face. He gasped for air, playing the role of a traumatized survivor with terrifying precision. He asked about his wife, his voice cracking, his body trembling, while medics gently lifted the crying infant from the ruined bed. The physical evidence surrounding them seemed irrefutable. The suffocated dog swinging from the banister, the shattered basement window, the ransacked drawers. It was a perfectly staged diorama of extreme violence, designed to overwhelm the senses of the first responders and dictate the entire trajectory of the investigation. By dawn, the quiet street was choked with satellite trucks and idling police cruisers. The narrative hit the national news cycle with the force of a bomb. A young mother murdered, a heroic aviator bound and helpless, a baby left to cry next to a corpse. It bypassed logic and struck directly at the deepest suburban fears. The social echo was instantaneous and paralyzing. The affluent enclave of Glycanera transformed into a fortress. Residents who had slept with windows cracked open for the Aegean breeze suddenly locked their doors. Hardware stores within a 50-mile radius sold out of heavy deadbolts, security cameras, and motion sensors in a matter of hours. The illusion of safety evaporated. The community was gripped by the terrifying myth of a heavily armed phantom militia scaling their fences in the dead of night. The brutality of the described crime forced an unprecedented government reaction. Authorities issued a massive financial bounty, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, for any information leading to the capture of the gang. A specialized high-pressure task force was assembled. Their entire initial strategy was dictated by the grieving widower. He fed them a highly specific profile of his attackers. He claimed there were 3 men. He noted they were short, incredibly violent, and spoke a foreign language, specifically pointing toward an Eastern European origin. It was a calculated misdirection, exploiting regional anxieties to send the police chasing ghosts through the criminal underworld. While detectives scoured border crossings and squeezed informants, the pilot took center stage. He did not retreat into private mourning. Instead, he stepped directly in front of the television cameras. Standing just feet away from where he had extinguished his wife's life, his face drawn and exhausted, he delivered a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He addressed the nation, begging the public to help find the monsters who destroyed his family. His audacity peaked during the funeral on the island. Surrounded by her devastated community, he stood by the grave holding his infant child. He physically leaned on his mother-in-law, embracing the very woman whose daughter he had violently erased. His performance was flawless, devoid of any visible cracks. Public sympathy swelled into a massive wave of national mourning. He believed he was completely untouchable. Meanwhile, the task force hit the midpoint pivot of the investigation, spiraling into frustration. They were hunting a crew that did not exist. They pulled files on every known property theft ring operating within 100 miles of the capital. The intense pressure to produce results yielded a false positive. Border police apprehended a Georgian national attempting to cross into a neighboring country. The man possessed a criminal record for burglary and vaguely matched the physical parameters provided by the pilot. He was detained, transferred to a high-security interrogation room, and pressed relentlessly for a confession. The media immediately leaked the arrest, allowing the terrified public to briefly exhale. But inside the concrete walls of police headquarters, the phantom narrative began to stall. The detained man vehemently denied any involvement in the suburban execution. His alibi held up to scrutiny. Then, the forensic results returned from the lab. The DNA was a complete mismatch. The fingerprints lifted from the fractured basement window frame did not align with his. The authorities had no choice but to release him. The task force was back to zero. Weeks had passed, the trail was freezing over, and the massive financial reward remained unclaimed. In the grit and reality of violent crime, a crew sophisticated enough to bypass perimeter security, execute a brutal home invasion, and vanish without leaving a single trace of forensic material simply does not exist without someone in the underworld whispering about it. Yet street informants were completely silent. The money was on the table, but nobody was talking. The silence was the first real clue. The lead detective sat in a room plastered with crime scene photographs and timeline boards, staring at the dead ends. The external threat wasn't making sense. The physics of the break-in felt wrong. The lack of biological evidence from a brutal struggle was impossible. Slowly, the focus in the room shifted. They stopped looking outward at the phantom burglars and turned their attention back to the only adult who walked out of that attic alive. The physical crime scene was a masterpiece of violent misdirection, but physical spaces have limitations. They are strictly bound by the laws of physics and biology. The lead investigators, staring at empty evidence boards and sterile lab reports, realized they had been looking at the wrong layer of reality. Traditional forensics were offering zero traction. The fingerprint dust yielded nothing but the family's own prints. The DNA swabs came back completely clean. There was no foreign blood spatter to analyze because the murder weapon was a soft, heavy pillow. The phantom burglars had moved through the house like ghosts because they did not exist. The tactical pivot was sharp and absolute. The Hellenic police stopped hunting for men in the shadows and turned their entire focus toward the invisible, indestructible realm of digital data. They shifted from theatrical lies to clinical mathematics. The tri-level suburban property was a highly connected, modern environment, and the first devastating anomaly emerged from the home's own surveillance architecture. The pilot had explicitly stated that the intruders neutralized the security camera in the living room immediately upon entering through the basement window. He claimed they ripped the physical memory card out of the console to blind the system, covering their tracks perfectly. It was a logical, expected sequence of events for a professional crew. However, routers, security software, and cloud applications maintain internal log files, digital ledgers that record every single action taken on the network, down to the millisecond. When the cybercrimes unit bypassed the missing physical SD card and extracted the core command logs from the central server, the narrative suffered its first fatal fracture. The data revealed exactly when the camera was disconnected. It was not violently disabled during a chaotic early morning breach. The The log showed a manual, authorized command executed through a remote smartphone application. Someone with administrative access had deliberately powered down the recording hardware and ejected the memory card, hours before the supposed thieves ever set foot on the property. The system was blinded from the inside out. The second and most profound betrayal came from the victim herself. Though her voice had been violently silenced, the hardware strapped to her wrist continued to testify. She was wearing a biometric smartwatch, a sophisticated piece of wearable technology designed to monitor sleep cycles, track fitness progression, and measure heart rate by reading the blood flow beneath the skin. Investigators bypassed physical warrants and directly subpoenaed the tech manufacturer, pulling the encrypted health data straight from the cloud servers. The resulting graph was not just a piece of circumstantial evidence, it was a digital autopsy. It mapped her final hours with brutal, indisputable precision. The timeline laid out by the husband completely disintegrated against the hard metrics. The sensors recorded her in a state of deep, resting sleep. Then, the lines shifted abruptly. The heart rate spiked into the extreme ranges, indicating severe physical distress and an overwhelming adrenaline dump. The watch logged the chaotic, erratic movements of a desperate, terrifying struggle for survival. It recorded the agonizing minutes of forced asphyxiation, the raw biological panic of a failing respiratory system fighting against heavy downward pressure. And then, the line simply dropped. The biometric sensors registered a complete cessation of a pulse, a total flatline. The exact time of biological death was permanently etched into the server logs. This irrefutable timestamp proved she was dead hours before the alleged break-in even commenced. The husband had been sleeping next to a corpse, waiting for the right moment to stage the invasion. The final piece of the digital puzzle completely dismantled the pilot's carefully constructed alibi. He had sworn to the first responders, and later to the entire nation on television, that he had been ambushed in his bed. He described being thrown to the floor planks, tightly bound with heavy rope, blindfolded with thick silver tape, and left utterly paralyzed while the attackers ransacked the house and executed his wife. He claimed he was completely immobile for hours, fighting against his restraints until dawn, but his own smartphone was resting in his pocket. Modern cellular devices are equipped with highly sensitive internal hardware, accelerometers, gyroscopes, and pedometers, designed to constantly track user activity. Tech units extracted the raw spatial data from his phone. During the exact window of time, he swore he was tied up and lying face down on the floor. His device was actively moving. The pedometer logged distinct, calculated steps. The gyroscope and altimeter registered significant elevation changes. The data painted a perfect, spatial map of his movements through the house. He was not paralyzed, he was pacing. The timeline of his steps perfectly aligned with the destruction of the property. The data showed him walking down the stairs to the ground floor, matching the exact time the puppy was suffocated and suspended from the banister. It showed him moving to the basement, the exact time the window frame was fractured from the inside out to simulate a point of entry. It showed him moving back up to the attic to bind himself, scatter the jewelry, and eventually dial the emergency dispatch. He had spent hours methodically directing a nightmare, and his own pocket computer had silently recorded every single spatial shift. The investigators now held absolute, mathematical proof. The violent foreign mob was a ghost story. The grieving, traumatized widower was a cold-blooded executioner. But the revelation triggered a highly volatile tactical dilemma. The authorities possessed the evidence to secure an arrest warrant, but the suspect was not in Athens. He was 175 miles away, standing on the rugged cliffs of Anagnostopoulos. He was attending a memorial service for the woman he had murdered, completely surrounded by her grieving parents, her friends, and the tight-knit island community. The police knew they were dealing with an intelligent, highly controlling narcissist. If he caught even the slightest hint that the investigation had turned toward him, the situation could escalate into a secondary disaster. He was a licensed aviator. He had the financial resources and the technical ability to charter a flight, steal a boat, or slip across international borders before a mainland strike team could cross the Aegean Sea. Furthermore, making a violent, high-profile arrest at the victim's memorial service, in front of the mother whose grief he was actively exploiting, was an operational risk they were unwilling to take. They needed a flawless strategy of extraction. They had to lure the predator away from the island and back to the heavily fortified mainland, using his own massive ego and need for control against him. The detectives drafted a psychological trap. They decided to contact him during the memorial service under the guise of a major investigative breakthrough. They would tell him the exact lie he desperately wanted to hear, that they had finally caught the phantom killers at the border, and they urgently needed his expertise to identify a suspect in a lineup. The plan relied entirely on his arrogant belief that he had outsmarted the entire justice system, that he was still the smartest man in the room, seamlessly directing the show. The extraction was flawlessly executed. Detectives approached the widower following the island memorial, quietly explaining they had apprehended a suspect and urgently needed his visual confirmation. His ego took the bait. He boarded a police helicopter to Athens, fully believing he was still directing the narrative. But the moment the heavy doors of the interrogation room locked behind him, the illusion evaporated. There was no lineup. Instead, investigators silently slid a printed graph across the metal table, the biometric flatline from his wife's smartwatch, juxtaposed against his own smartphone pedometer logs. The data was absolute. The pilot stared at the mathematical proof of his guilt, and his carefully engineered facade shattered entirely. During 8 grueling hours of relentless questioning, his defenses collapsed. Stripped of his theatricality, he admitted to the execution. He detailed a volatile argument earlier that night, where she explicitly threatened to leave and take their infant daughter. Faced with the prospect of public abandonment and the ultimate loss of control, he chose annihilation. The legal consequence was unyielding. The courts stripped him of his aviation rank and public standing, handing down a maximum life sentence for premeditated murder, plus 10 additional years for killing the dog and staging the violent scene. The man who demanded total control over his environment was reduced to a rigid, state-mandated prison schedule, locked inside a concrete cell where he dictated absolutely nothing. The Glyka Nera execution stands as a stark warning about the modern masks people wear. To the outside world, the aviator and his young bride represented an affluent, untouchable ideal, a perfect existence constructed through calculated curation. But behind the heavy suburban deadbolts lay a reality of absolute subjugation. Ultimately, it wasn't a seasoned detective or a street informant that broke his flawless script. The only witness to his brutality was a silent, unfeeling string of digital code, proving that even the most meticulously directed lies cannot erase the math of a stopping heart. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.